I'm Kayla with Bryomonitoring Canada. We made some videos to show our volunteers how to identify the species of moss that we're looking to sample for our project. So that's the stair-step moss and the red stem moss. However, when you're first learning to identify moss and developing an eye for moss, it can be helpful to see those species beside some species that we're not looking to sample. So there are some similar species, and it can help if we can see the ones we want beside the ones we don't want. So that's what this video is for, and we picked a nice spot here in the forest where we have some stair-step moss, and we have a bit of the red stem moss, and then we have some other species growing with them. And that's what you'll find when you go out looking for moss. You'll often find clusters of species growing side by side or mixed together. And when I first go into the field and I start looking for moss, I just take a look at the general area and I look for sort of textures and colors. And it reminds me a little bit of when it's spring and the leaves are first coming on the trees, and you can pick out in the forest the different types of trees because they sort of have a different shade of green and a different vibrancy. So in our patch that we have here, this section over here is our stair-step moss, and it's quite a dull green. When it's quite dry, we've just had a rain, but when it's dry, it can almost get a little bit yellow. And then if we look over here to some of the other species, we see more of a brighter green. And when we're looking for a red stem moss, because it's got those red stems, it can often have a bit of an orangish tinge. But we'll see some other species that also have an orange tinge, and so it's really important that we zoom in and we get close and look at the branching pattern and the leaf shapes. So that's what we're going to do next. So I've got a couple samples here of the mosses that we do want to pick, and I've picked both of them right from this area. So we have our stair-step moss growing here. I'm just going to carefully grab out a little section, a nice one. Okay. So I have our stair-step moss and a red stem moss. The first thing to look for is that we want branching mosses. So if you find a moss that's a one straight stem with leaves coming off of the stem, we don't want any of those. So we're looking for branches where we have a stem and branches coming off a stem. And both of those have that. But you'll notice right away they look very different. So this one's got very spaced apart branches, and this one they're very closely clustered, and it gives it almost kind of a feather-like or fern-like appearance. Let's take a look at our stair-stem moss first. So from the other video, we know we're looking for those distinctive stems. And this time of year in spring, instead of seeing a full branch coming out of last year's growth, you'll just see these little, they almost look like little worms or snakes coming up out of the top. So that's how we identify our stair-stem moss in the spring. I do have a sample here of some of our stair-step moss from last year. And so these ones, you can see the previous year's growth and then the step coming up out more distinctly. A moss that we're going to look in a minute at a moss that's similar in the way that it has lots of little branches. But I'm going to move over and take a look at our red stem moss first, so that we have an example of both of the mosses we want to see. The red stem moss is branching, and if I give it a little spray with a spray bottle, I can see that distinctive red stem coming up the middle. Get rid of that one. It's not the only moss, though, that has a red stem. So I have another one here that I found that has a red stem, and the colors are very similar. The branching pattern is similar. This one does have branches, but our red stem moss, the branches are coming more or less flat or on the same plane out from the stem. This one is much shaggier and has branches coming out at all directions. It's also a lot bigger, or we might say that it's more robust, and you can see the individual leaves on the branches much better because they're much bigger. So this one we're not interested in. This is the one we want to keep. I have another sample of a moss that's growing in this area that again has a branching pattern and is often mistaken for the other mosses that we're sampling. This one, the common name is the knight's plume moss, and you can really identify it by the very, very regular branching pattern where the branches come out from the stem, and it goes wider and then to a point. And so it really has this very delicate feathery look and looks like a feathered plume on a knight's helmet. If you look at it from the top, the stem looks a little bit reddish sometimes, but if you flip it over and look at the underside, you won't see any red stem. And if you look very closely at the leaves, we won't be able to zoom in enough in the video, you'll see that the leaves actually hook and curl. They're tiny, tiny leaves, and they hook and curl around the back. And if we're looking at our red stem moss, the leaves will not do that. They're more straight out. And what else do we have here? I can grab some other mosses that are kind of mixed in with our stair stem and our red stem moss, but as soon as we pick a piece and we take a closer look, they don't really resemble the shape of either of those mosses at all. Okay, we've moved to a new spot here that has a few different species, so we can do a little bit more comparing. Like I said, when we're looking for the red stem moss, we can kind of see it's got a bit of an orangish tinge sometime because the red of that stem is showing through the leaves. This moss here also has a bit of a yellow orangish tinge. This is not one of the species we're sampling, but again, often confused with the ones that we are. So not only does it have a little bit of a similar color, when we look at it compared to our stair-step moss, it has a very similar branching pattern. And sometimes the stem color can be the same too. The stair-step moss is more of an olive green, and this one tends to be orangish or sometimes a very deep green. In this particular example, it does branch quite a bit, but it doesn't have that very abrupt 90-degree new stem coming out from the old stem. So there may be new stems coming out or new branches growing, but they grow along the same plane as the original stem. And compare again to our stair-step moss, where our new growth, which is right now those little, looks like little worm heads or snake heads, they're coming straight up out of the old growth. So those are some examples of similar species that we'll see in the field. We've got some of our red stem moss again here. So we're looking to pick a red stem moss and stair-step moss. And if we do not see the same identifying features, it's probably one of these similar species, but not the ones that we're looking for. So hopefully that helps. And if you'd like more information about our moss sampling project, you can see www.bryomonitoring.ca.